Now that No Way Home is out, it's time to rank all the Spider-Man movies, so I don't need much of an intro, let's just get right into the ranking. So starting at number 9, all the way at the bottom, no surprise here, The Amazing Spider-Man 2. I don't even know where to start with this. Everything bad about this movie has obviously been said a million times over, but it really did just misfire on so many levels, and I really feel bad for both Andrew and Emma because I feel like they are both a great Spider-Man and Gwen, but there's just too much happening in this movie. It's just a complete mess. They never learned from the mistakes that were made in Spider-Man 3, and in fact, I feel like they did the mistakes that were made in that movie and made them even worse. And by that mistake, I mean the villain problem. We have Rhino in the beginning of this movie. Electro is just the most cheesy version of a villain I've ever seen in my life, and it's so sad after No Way Home to see how much potential Jamie Foxx really had in that role. And there was absolutely no reason for Dane DeHaan to turn into Green Goblin later in this movie. You can just tell the studio is pushing insanely hard for a Sinister Six movie without taking any of the time to actually earn it and set it up properly. Like I said, I do feel bad for Andrew Garfield because I do feel like he is a good Spider-Man, but he just got handed some of the worst scripts and plots in the Spider-Man universe, and really not good. Coming in at number 8, and this hurts my heart to put it here, but Spider-Man 3. And this movie, it has very obvious problems, and that does not mean I hate it. I love all Spider-Man movies, obviously, but looking at this objectively, it is not a very well put together film. Venom was a complete misstep, and there was no reason to shove him into this. It's kind of the same thing I just talked about with The Amazing Spider-Man 2. It's just the studio saying, oh, here's Venom, this huge character, you're putting him in this movie, and it really takes away from what could have been a great villain in Sandman, but Sandman ultimately gets sidelined kind of for Venom in this. Some of the moments are so iconically corny that I love them, like the Bully Maguire scene. I don't think those take away from the film, but there's just some other missteps in here, and once again, I do feel bad for Tobey in this film because it's just the studio overstepping and filling up this movie with way more than it needed to have. The first two Spider-Man were just simple, smaller stories that were focused on Spider-Man and his one villain. Moving on to number 7, we have The Amazing Spider-Man. And I'm going to start with some positives about this movie because I do have more positives about this than the other two on the list that I got through already. Because once again, I think Andrew Garfield and Emma Stone are an amazing Peter Parker and Gwen Stacy, and I love their relationship that builds through this. And I do think a lot of the actual Spider-Manning scenes, the swinging, the fights, are actually incredible in this, and some of the most like comic accurate Spider-Man things that are just really cool to see on screen. But some of the things that bring this down for me is that we had to see the origin story again, and it takes like 25 minutes of the film. Like, everybody knows that Uncle Ben dies. They could have done that, but make it way quicker and just get into what we want to see faster. It was just the same thing done from the first Raimi trilogy, done poorly this time. And having Peter Parker's parents in the beginning, like, nobody cares about Peter Parker's parents. The only interesting thing about his parents are that they're dead. And then again with the villain problem, the Lizard originally just trying to fix his arm and then turning the city into lizard people is just so ridiculous, and it just doesn't work. So while I do think this is a pretty enjoyable movie to watch through, honestly, there is just enough problems that puts it lower than the rest of the movies on this list. Moving on to number 6 on our list, there's definitely a noticeable jump in quality here, Spider-Man Far From Home. Now, I do not have the same problems that other people have with this. Don't really mind the whole Iron Man connection to Mysterio and how it's kind of more Iron Man's problem than Peter Parker's problem, because I just appreciate how they kind of built up this trilogy, especially after No Way Home. I do not mind the Iron Man stuff at all. And I think the Mysterio fight sequences are some of the coolest looking things in the MCU and just Marvel history that we've ever seen on screen. And also, I feel like this is a film that definitely got enhanced by No Way Home, which sometimes, you know, a sequel can make the other film kind of feel useless, but it definitely feels like this was a very necessary step in our Tom Holland's Peter Parker's path, and it is an enjoyable film. Like I said, I don't have any glaring grievances with this film. It's just a pretty good film, but definitely not better than the other ones on this list. Coming in at number 5, and this is gonna get me some hate, I'm sure, but hear me out. Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse is at number 5 on my list, and I know this is like number 1 in all superhero movies for some other people. I really do enjoy this movie. Like I said, this top 5 and 6 is really just all movies I enjoy, but it's kind of like picking between your favorite children. And when it comes down to personal preference for me, I really enjoy this movie and I can appreciate what it did, but when it comes to me, I just prefer live action movies. That's just me. I can appreciate the amazing animation in this movie. I love the art style in it. The fight at the end with Kingpin is so amazing looking. And for someone that likes that, I really don't watch many animated movies at all. And I did love this movie when I watched it and have rewatched it since, and I still love it. It's definitely probably the most creative movie on this entire list out of all the Spider-Man movies. I mean, I love Miles's relationship with his dad he's got going. I love him just, you know, learning to be Spider-Man, and I love all the other Spider-Mans from other universes. Spider-Gwen is great in this movie. Like I said, I don't really have anything negative to say about this, so please put your pitchforks away from me putting it at number 5. But I just personally prefer some of the live action ones over this, so let's move on before I get my house burned down for this take. Coming in at number 4 is the original Spider-Man, and this is the perfect example of why the villains are so important in these movies, and why some of the lowest ones on my list had the weakest villains. Willem Dafoe as Green Goblin might be one of my favorite Spider-Man villains of all time. It is literally a living comic book character.
But you can't do this to me. I started this company. You know how much I sacrificed?
So animated, and it's so perfect in this movie, and I think a living comic book is the best way to describe this movie. Whereas the Amazing Spider-Man did the origin story, I feel like, a bit worse in this film. I did really enjoy seeing the origin story in this movie, and maybe it just benefits from being the first Spider-Man movie that we get to see it in, but I think it was done better in this movie personally. The only gripe I have with this and kind of all the Raimi Spider-Man movies is Mary Jane. I just think she's a super weak character in this entire franchise. She never really has anything to do. She kind of just causes problems. I find her annoying. But it's not enough to take away from this amazing movie, and like I said, Green Goblin just makes this a whole different level of a film. Coming in at number 3, we have Spider-Man Homecoming, and like I said, I know a lot of people do not like the Iron Man being the Uncle Ben in this universe, at least at this point, but I really don't mind it, and I actually think it works pretty well, and maybe that's just because I'm a super biased Iron Man fan. I think he's the greatest Avenger, but I think their connection works really well in this. I love seeing Spider-Man just being this, like, he is just a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man at the beginning. He wants to be an Avenger, but nobody wants to give him the chance. We get to see his high school life and the crushes and going to parties that fits more because he doesn't look like a 47-year-old man like some of the other Spider-Man do. I think Liz works great as a love interest in this film. I know Mary Jane is obviously the person, or Michelle Jones, who is Mary Jane, fight me on that, is obviously the real love interest in this franchise, but I think Liz works great in this film as the primary love interest. And once again with the villains, Michael Keaton as the Vulture is incredible. Like the scene where Peter is in the car with Liz going to Homecoming and the Vulture is obviously driving is one of the most intense and my favorite scenes in the MCU. I wish we got more shots and scenes like this in the MCU, but they don't really seem to go that direction. And while it's not like the most true Spider-Man film that has ever been made, obviously with like Karen and his suit that he can talk to, I think it really added a fun dynamic to it. And it really lets you see just Peter being kind of a kid that's just having fun with it and acting how a real high school teen would. And for that, I think coming in at 2 is Spider-Man 2. And this is as close to a perfect just Peter Parker story as we can get. We're a few years into him being Spider-Man, and he is just unhappy in all regards. He doesn't have Mary Jane anymore. He's failing at school. He can't keep a job. So he's struggling with the real life parts, and that makes him struggle as Spider-Man with his powers as well. And that paired with one of the best villains we've ever gotten in Dr. Octopus. It is just truly amazing. I love seeing their connection at the beginning before Doc Ock obviously goes to Dr. Octopus. I love the fight scenes in this between Spider-Man and Doc Ock. Like I said, the internal struggle he has with becoming Spider-Man and staying Spider-Man after so many years of being defeated is just amazing, and I absolutely love this film. I don't really have any major issues with it at all, and it definitely deserves this number 2 spot. But coming in at number 1, maybe it's recency bias. I'll have to redo this in a couple months and see what I think then, but I have to do it. It was just such an enjoyable experience. Spider-Man No Way Home is at number 1. So I'm going to go into some spoilers into my reasoning behind why I think this film deserves number 1. So if you haven't seen it yet, I appreciate you watching this far. Just drop a like and you can stop watching right now if you haven't seen it, but now I'm going to get into the spoilers. So what I truly love about this film is obviously there's crazy things that happen, like, you know, all the villains from the old movies that I've already talked about, how I love some of these, and even the ones I didn't like in the Amazing Spider-Man movies, they do really good in this film. And like I said, there's spoilers, so if you haven't heard this, click away, it's not my fault. And obviously the big reveal of Tobey and Andrew ultimately being in this film are incredible, but I want to get into some of the smaller things that made me really appreciate this. First of all, we see Peter Parker having the Peter Parker struggles of he is making these decisions that are costing him family and ultimately his happiness, and it's just making everything go wrong because he's trying to do good. This is the ultimate Spider-Man struggle. He's trying to do the right thing all the time, and it just comes back to bite him. And I love how this makes him a dark Peter Parker. He wants to kill Green Goblin. He is done with it. He is absolutely defeated, and he just wants vengeance. And obviously seeing Tobey and Andrew back is just so fulfilling. It made me just smile like an idiot in the theater. Then we have the smaller things like just a Daredevil cameo, which wasn't even that big in this film, but obviously it's big for the rest of the MCU. And how can I not talk about the ending of this film that I love, because once again, it is Peter having a bittersweet victory. He still has the struggles. He doesn't have MJ and Ned anymore. He doesn't have anyone And although that might have just been a cop-out by Sony to say, hey, if we take him back into our universe, this is a way to explain why he's not a part of the Avengers anymore, I still think it works, although I hope that's not why they had this ending, and I hope he does stay in the MCU. So like I said, I'm not sure if it's recency bias, but I really don't care. I love this movie. It is the most fun I had watching a Spider-Man movie in the theaters, and at the end of the day, it comes down to fun. It was an obvious nostalgia grab, fan service to the max degree. I am a fan of Spider-Man movies, so it works for me, and I don't regret having this at number 1. What I want you to do is in the comments give me your worst Spider-Man movie and your favorite Spider-Man movie, and if you're feeling extra froggy, you can comment your entire list ranking all 9. So thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.